Well, it's one for the money.
Welcome to the history of Rockabilly. Rockabilly is interesting because the history of Rockabilly is the history of two distinct but often related styles of music, and their marriage together several of times throughout the decades. The word Rockabilly is a portmanteau of two words, rock and roll, of course, and hillbilly. Once upon a time, country and western music was called hillbilly music. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, the most important ingredient in Rockabilly is definitely the blues. I'm very tempted to go down a rabbit hole on the blues, but I'll spare you, and I'll just give you a little crash course. So the blues was developed in the southern United States from Negro spirituals, work songs, and field hollers from slaves. Because of the disenfranchisement of black people, the early history of the blues is unfortunately very poorly documented. In fact, nobody really knew what the blues was until the 1910s and 1920s, by which time it had already been very well established as a genre. And unfortunately, around this time, music that was marketed toward black people, namely blues-influenced music, was called race records. But I want to include this song in my chronology. It's called Jim Jackson's Kansas City Blues. I believe it was the first record to sell 1 million copies, which is a huge triumph for the blues because it was competing against very popular jazz music and traditional pop music. So one of the most enduring legacies of blues music is the 12-bar blues chord progression. It's pretty simple and it's easily the most common chord progression in blues music. I'll show you how it goes. You play the 1 chord, and then the 4 chord, and then the 1 chord, and then the 5, 4, 1. Now, for those of you who don't understand music theory, I'll tell you what that means real quick. So think about the do, re, mi, solfege. When I say 4 chord, 5 chord, stuff like that, all I mean is do, re, mi, fa, fa. That's the 4 chord. So when I say I play the 1 chord, I'm just going do, 4 chord, fa, 1 chord, do, 5 chord, so, fa, do. And just to show you how ubiquitous this chord progression was in early rock and roll and rockabilly, consider this. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Good golly, Miss Molly, you sure have a ball. Well, you can do anything but lay off of my blue suede shoes. So the next ingredient in rockabilly would be country and western, or hillbilly music. Country music started in the 1920s, and it was directly derivative of Appalachian folk music, which in turn, because of all the Scotch-Irish settlers there, was influenced by the Scotch-Irish fiddle style. Think this. Not to mention, the banjo was actually derivative of an African instrument called the akonting. Forgive me if I butchered the pronunciation. It used to be made of a gourd. I don't know what the strings were made of, but eventually it evolved into the banjo in the southern Appalachian United States. Bands would get together, play the fiddle, the banjo, and I don't know why the guitar became so popular. The guitar as we know it today is a Spanish instrument, and it's not like there were a bunch of Spanish settlers in the region at the time, but nonetheless, the fiddle, the guitar, and the banjo came together to form this uniquely American style of music. So now that we've gone over a brief history of the blues and of country music, I think a good early example of a marriage of the two styles would be the recordings of Jimmie Rodgers. Jimmie Rogers is regarded as the father of country music, and for good reason. I believe the story goes he and his Appalachian folk style ensemble were set to record in the studio, and he was the only one who showed up. So it was just him and his guitar. Something that set the blues apart from Appalachian folk music is blues musicians were writing their own songs, whereas a lot of Appalachian folk musicians were just playing a lot of American folk songs from the Great American Songbook. Well, Jimmie Rogers wrote a lot of his own songs, not to mention he's playing this in the 12-bar blues, and another interesting touch, he yodeled. That would have an influence on later country music singing styles like Hank Williams. This song is Blue Yodel Number 1, and it came out in 1927. So what was the blues up to in the late 20s and early 30s? Well, a very popular style of piano blues called boogie woogie was emerging. The style itself is pretty old, but when it became a blues style, it really came into its own. If you think about this all too familiar bass line, and it's often played in 12-bar blues, the right hand kind of solos over this driving bass line, and that's boogie woogie. Directly influenced by boogie woogie would be this fun, danceable style of the blues called jump blues. It took the bass lines and the rhythm of boogie woogie and just kind of adapted it to this fun, danceable style. A lot of jump blues musicians were veterans of the swing era. So if they knew one thing, it was how to make people get up and dance. A lot of the lyrical themes included dancing, carrying on, and having a good time. This song is Shake, Rattle, and Roll by Big Joe Turner. I believe it came out in 1938, and it was an important milestone in the blues. I think a lot of rock and roll and rockabilly musicians would go on to cover this song. Another facet that cannot go unnamed when talking about the history of rockabilly is, of course, the electric guitar. A lot of ensembles in the 30s featured a guitar. Jazz ensembles, country and western bands, and blues groups. It worked as a rhythmic instrument to keep rhythm and play chords, but it didn't really work as a melodic lead instrument because it was just so quiet. It wasn't as loud as the drums, the pianos, and the brass instruments. Enter the electric guitar. I believe the first commercially available electric guitar came out in the early 30s. It caught on by the end of the decade in a lot of these ensembles. And a movement that notably picked it up was electric blues. A lot of Chicago blues musicians started playing the electric guitar. Some early heroes of this movement would be Muddy Waters, T-Bone Walker, and Pat Hare. This is Rollin' Stone by Muddy Waters. So another important iteration of country and western music would be western swing. It was popular in like the late 30s and early 40s, and it was basically country music ensembles who took a couple cues from swing music, giving instruments turns at soloing and stuff like that. It had country and western instrumentation, but they would also throw in some maybe brass instruments from jazz. And if you listen up here, it's another example of an early usage of the electric guitar. So this is another marriage of country styles and blues styles that would be an important predecessor for rockabilly music. This song is Ida Red by Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys. So by the 1940s, the music industry had smartly dropped the Race Records moniker and changed the name of the radio format to Rhythm and Blues. So early rhythm and blues wasn't so much a distinct genre as it was kind of a collection of closely related genres that they would play on the radio together. Early rhythm and blues was basically a successor to the jump blues style that we talked about earlier. This is Roy Brown's Good Rockin' Tonight from 1947. It's an early example of the usage of rockin' in a musical context, And so this song is a contender for the first rock and roll song. By the late 1940s, the predominant style of country music was honky-tonk music. It has this strong driving beat that you can stomp your feet to. And by this point, country music had come to embrace the steel guitar as one of its staple instruments. Merriam-Webster also describes honky-tonk music as having lyrics about vice or misfortune. And those lyrical themes would kind of be synonymous with country music lyrics from this point on. This is Hank Williams, Move It On Over. I think this came out in 1947. And it was in the 12-bar blues. But by this point, I think most country music was informed by the blues in some way, shape, or form. By the early 50s, rock and roll definitely existed. You could argue ad nauseum about the first actual rock and roll song, but the song that I see cited slightly more than others is Rocket 88 by Ike Turner. I wanted to include that in the history of rockabilly because it was covered, I think, in 1952 by Bill Haley and his Comets. This is the same Bill Haley that sang Rock Around the Clock. And this is kind of how rockabilly was born. Musicians with a country and western background like Bill Haley, Elvis Presley, or Carl Perkins would cover some of these rhythm and blues songs, early rock and roll songs, and blues standards. By the late 1950s, rockabilly had solidified as a genre. It was no longer country and western musicians playing rhythm and blues covers, but it was a unique genre of its own. This is my favorite rockabilly musician, Eddie Cochran, and his rockabilly classic, Summertime Blues, that would be covered by many rock musicians. So I hope you enjoyed my history of rockabilly. I couldn't do the genre justice without talking about all of its predecessors and the directions that they took to lead to rockabilly.